Greetings, everyone. I am the Reverend Jill Olds, the director of the Yale Youth Ministry Institute at Yale Divinity School. The YMI is very pleased to welcome all of you to today's gathering entitled Storytelling with Spirituality with Mark Yaconelli. If this is your first event with us, welcome. If we are well known to you, welcome. We're delighted you are here. For our time today, Mr. Yaconelli will speak to us. We'll have a brief Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We ask that you please remain muted throughout our time together, except when asking questions or during our breakout room sessions. We'll also be monitoring the chat window, so if you have a question in there, please feel free to put it in at any time. Our office has a great staff. I'd like to introduce them to you quickly and thank them for their work. The YMI falls under the purview of the Center for Continuing Education. So we have Kelly Morrissey, the managing director of the center, and we have Megan Lukens, our communications coordinator. Thank you both for being here, for all that you do, and for who you are. If you are new to the Yale Youth Ministry Institute, we invite you to peruse our website when you get a free chance. That's yaleyouthministryinstitute.org, and that will be in the chat. We have a whole array of resources on there, curricula for your youth, training modules for youth leaders, discussion forums. We have over 1,000 video clips and lectures given by the world's leading youth ministry experts. We have resources for anti-racism work, for youth working through mental health struggles. We have mission and outreach endeavors, links to other articles and material, the works. All of that is available for free, so please do check out our website. This is our gathering for this year's Lunch Lab series, and it is our inaugural effort, jointly sponsored by the YMI and the national setting of the United Church of Christ, in offering a set of webinars. The UCC's Love of Children program was awarded a $1.25 million grant through the Nurturing Children Through Worship and Prayer initiative by the Lilly Endowment. Through this program, the United Church of Christ has committed to an intentional 4-year-long period to research the state of children's ministry, equip ministry leaders to make meaningful changes to include children in the life of the church, to create resources and strengthen relationships among clergy and volunteers, all for the benefit of our youngest members and friends. Today, we have the Reverend Tracy Potter and the Reverend Tyler Ung with us on today's webinar representing that program. Welcome, Reverend Potter and Reverend Ung. One such way the Love of Children is living out its purpose is through a partnership with us at YMI to create 6 educational webinars each year around some of the most pressing areas of youth ministry. Children's ministry, rather. My apologies. Some of those topics therein will include childhood development, storytelling with youth, tending to parents, children in worship, trauma-informed ministry with children, and fostering prophetic action in young people. Our next gathering will be on Wednesday, April 2nd at the same time, 12 p.m. Eastern, and we will hear from Episcopal Canon Wendy Claire Berry on the meaningful inclusion of children in worship, theology, and praxis. So we invite you to join us for that as well. If you'd like to hear more about the Love of Children initiative, please also visit www.ucc.org/loveofchildren. Again, all these links will be found in the chat. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you all to today's speaker, Mr. Mark Yaconelli. Mark Yaconelli is an author, retreat leader, spiritual director, story catcher, husband, and father. He is the founder and executive director of The Hearth, a nonprofit that utilizes personal storytelling to heal and connect and enrich and mobilize communities for good. Mark is also a co-founder of the Center for Engaged Compassion, which seeks to cultivate compassion for peace and reconciliation. Interviews and profiles of Mark's work have appeared in numerous outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, BBC Radio, and ABC World News Tonight. He is the author of several books, including The Gift of Hard Things, Contemplative Youth Ministry, and his recent work, Between the Listening and the Telling, How Stories Can Save Us. Mark lives in Oregon with his family. Mark, welcome. We're really glad to have you today.
Thank you. It's good to be here with all you folks. So we're talking about story, and this is the primary practice in the Christian faith, right? It's story that turns bread and wine into the body and blood. It's story that helps us not only learn some of the images and activities of Jesus, but helps us to experience the way in which that luminous divine love moves through Jesus and not only touches the characters that we read in the Bible, but can access our own soul as well. So story is this sacred spiritual practice, a core practice in the Christian faith. And if you go back into the Jewish tradition, you have people like Elie Wiesel saying that the way he understood story is that God created human beings because God loves stories. This is partly, or if you go into the Native American tradition here in North America, the writer Thomas King says the truth about stories is that's all we are. And you know this a little bit because, at the end of our lives, what we end up leaving are the stories we told and the stories we lived. So stories has this multifaceted um, um, way in which our human experience interacts with the way in which story makes meaning, the way it lines up what we've lived and what we've suffered and what we've overcome. But I want to start here. If you're lucky, when you were a child, people told you stories. If you're lucky, you had that grandmother or the good babysitter or that first grade teacher who would tell you stories, right? And you would remember that experience. It would be bedtime, and your grandmother would say, "Okay, if you help clean the room, I'll tell you a story tonight." And so you'd get the room clean and get the PJs on and hop in bed. And if she was a really great grandmother, a really creative person, she would tell a story about you, right? She would say, "One night it was you and me. We were in Saskatchewan in a little cabin up in the woods. It was just you and me. And outside the cabin, we could hear a little noise. Was it a scary noise? It was a little bit scary, but we weren't sure. And you and I we lit the old lantern that we found by the door, and we started to go outside. And there we saw a giant bear holding a guitar." And, you would suddenly notice that in that story world, you and your grandmother would leave the bedroom and leave your bodies and leave time and space, and you would be in this other place, this liminal space where you could access courage and creativity and adventure and humor, and you had this kind of freedom in the story world, right? And you would use this spiritual power of imagination to leave time and space and go into those realms. So when my daughter was 3 years old, she refused to wear clothes, and it didn't. So we would, you try different things, right? But she would say they're too bumpy, or it's too slippery, or I don't like it on my neck, and whoosh, the clothes would go off. And we were trying all different kinds of things because the problem was we live up here in the mountains in Southern Oregon. We couldn't go outside because as it got colder and colder, if we were walking around with a naked child, our neighbors would call Child Protection Services. So we had to stay indoors with this kid. We were kind of held hostage. And it didn't matter what we tried, she didn't like how it felt on her body. And so one night, this is in January, it's dark here in the wintertime, and we were feeling stir crazy. And my wife said, "We are all going out for pizza tonight. I'm going to take the boys and get in the van, and you get Gracie dressed and meet us in the van." And Gracie, of course, was standing there looking like, "Oh, okay, we'll see how this goes."
Carol's in the luncheon?
Yeah.
And so I go upstairs and I start to find the clothes that I know that Grace can often wear. And I mean, sometimes she might allow us to put them on her. They're this kind of this velvet pants and shirt, and I put them on her. And as soon as she gets them on, she starts saying, too loose, it's too loose. And she takes them off. And I go into the story brain, right? So I run to the window and I look out and I say, Grace, you can't, you can't yell too loose. And she says, why? And I said, well, that's the name of the littlest fawn who lives up in the mountains up there in the fawn village. She says, where? Right up there. See, right above the houses where the trees start, that's where they live. And if you yell Toulouse, fawns, they have goat legs and, then the human upper body, and they got the little pointed ears, and their ears will hear you yelling Toulouse, and Toulouse will come down into the town. Well, I don't want them to, I want him to come into the town. No, we don't, because people will grab him. So you can't yell Toulouse. Now, as I'm talking, I'm putting on pants and shirt. And I start to say, now Toulouse didn't like to play with the other young fawns. Toulouse liked to play with the oldest fawn, and his name was Styx. And I started weaving the world of the fawn village and the little fawn named Toulouse and his friend Styx. And as I'm talking, and as I kept talking, she left her body. She left her time and space in our home. She went into that other world, and we were able to have pizza out, as long as I kept telling the story. Now, when we got back, every night from then on, she would say, could you tell a Toulouse story before bed? And so this became this series, right? Every night. Well, one time, Toulouse the fawn wanted to befriend a human child. And so he saw this. He knew he needed to find a child who was trustworthy and good. And he one time saw this little girl. Her name was Grace. And Dad, that's my name. Weird. That's true. It is your name. Anyways, he met this little girl named Grace, and they started to play together. And I started weaving every night stories of Toulouse and Grace. Well, 6 months go by. Grace says on a Saturday morning, Dad, can we go up into the mountains and find the fawn village where the fawns live? And I said, okay. So we got backpacks. We put in a little notebook. We got snacks. We drove up. We lived near the Pacific Crest Trail, and we parked up there. And we walked the trail. And where we live, there's giant cedars and Douglas fir and ponderosa pines, and there's enormous granite boulders that are sort of scattered in the woods up there. And she saw a cluster of these boulders, and she said, Dad, this is the fawn village. This is it. See, they make it look like rocks when people are around, but then when we're gone, it turns into their homes. And she starts looking around, and she finds a stick, and she goes, hey, Dad, look at this. This is one of their walking sticks. There's manzanita trees that have this kind of curled, thin bark, and she's like, oh, this is what they use for paper. She sees a burned out campfire with Pabst Blue Ribbon cans scattered on the ground. And she's like, Dad, this is what they drink, just like you. And so she's walking around, and all of a sudden she starts calling out, Fawns, Fawns, it's okay, it's Grace. Fawns, you can come out, it's me, it's Gracie. And she's walking around, and she's calling out, but there's no sound, and there's no sign of any fawns. And she looks a little bit confused. Well, we go, we play through the woods. We come home. All that week, I'm telling Gracie fawn stories, fawn and Grace adventure stories. And the next weekend, she says, Dad, can we go back to the fawn village? And on that Saturday, she had taken these walnut shells, just the halves of them, and she put little candies and little pictures that she had put on paper and then made very small. And she placed them in her backpack, and they were little offerings, little gifts. So we drive up to where the rocks are, and we get out, and she can't wait to get there. And she sets these little gifts in front of each giant boulder. And then she steps back and she says, Fawns, I have a surprise for you. Come out. Fawns, you can come out. It's Grace. And she's calling and she's looking and she's waiting, and they're not coming. And I start to get this troubled feeling inside, because I can tell that in the stories, the fawns trust the little girl because she's good and trustworthy. And I'm beginning to notice that Grace is wondering if this is a kind of judgment, right? They're not coming out to see her, and she looks troubled. And so I try to change the story. We don't know why fawns don't come out. Sometimes they're very nervous. Dad, that's not true. The fawns do come out to good people. So I tell my wife this at night, what's happening, and she says, well, you've created a real problem here, and you're going to have to figure this out. Because every weekend after that, Grace wants to go to the mountains with different gifts and different ways of trying to attract these fawns. I'm trying to change the stories. It's not working. And about 4 or 5 months in, Grace says to me one weekend, Dad, I want to go see the fawns, try to find them one last time. But if they don't come out, I don't want you to tell any more fawn stories. And I don't want to look for them anymore. So on that last trip up, she draws these elaborate pictures. She has me write notes. I transcribe what she wants me to say. And we go up in the mountains. She leaves the notes. She leaves the pictures. And she tells me, Dad, you need to call for the fawns too. So I'm calling fawns, fawns. And Dad, don't pretend to call. Really call. And so I'm trying to really call for these fawns. And we circle, and she looks, and they're not coming out. And she finally says, Dad, could you place me on top of that rock up there? Can you help me get up there? And so I push her so she can get on top of a rock. She stands on top of there. She closes her eyes. She puts her hands over her heart, and she starts to sing. Fawns, you can trust me. My name is Grace, and you can trust me. And she's singing this song, just pure voice and heart and longing. And I'm down there at the bottom of the rock, and my heart is breaking. What have I created here? She finishes her song. She opens her eyes. She looks around, and there's nothing. No sound, no movement, no fawns. And so I reach up and help her down, and I'm trying to fix this. And I say, Grace, we don't really know why. Dad, I don't want you to talk right now. And so we hold hands. She's sad. I'm sad. And I don't know what to do. And we just walk in silence. And I decide to take a particular trail that goes from the mountains above our home and drops into the town, into this 2-mile park we have in the city of Ashland called Lithia Park. And we're winding our way through the trees, and we come out into the edge of a wide grass field. And as we come to the edge of that field, there, standing in the middle of the grass, fur legs, a vest, a matted goatee, horns coming out of the side of his head, playing a wooden flute, is a fawn. Now, it turns out this was just some guy who was dressed in fur pants with this vest and this matted goatee, and he'd made a mask of oak leaves that he was seeing through, and he had wired deer antlers to his head. And he was dancing around playing this flute. Grace says, there he is. And I'm thinking, this guy's on drugs. But I had to play it through. So we're sitting there watching this guy dance around. We're holding hands. We walk out into the middle of the grass, and this guy, whoever he was, stops. And I say, hi, Mr. Fawn. This is my daughter, Grace. and we have been looking for you for months. And this cares about the woods, and she cares about fawns, and she's a really good person, and she just wanted to meet you." And this guy, whoever he is, gets low, so he's at eye contact with Gracie, and he says, "Oh gosh, I know Gracie is a good person, and I know you care about the woods, and I'd like to meet you too." And he puts out his hand, and Gracie puts out her little hand, and they shake. And then I say, "Grace, do you want to say anything?" And she says, "No." And then we kind of back off. And he says, "If you ever want to see me again, I come through here a couple times a year." And he points over to under some rhododendrons. There's a sleeping bag and a backpack, and he's a traveler. And we kind of back off, and I say, "Well, thank you so much." And then Grace lets go of my hand, and she starts running through the park yelling, "I saw a fawn, I saw a fawn, I saw a fawn." And when I finally catch up to her, she says, "Dad, now do you believe? Now do you believe?" Now, this is that power of story, right? To take us out of our bodies into time and space, and cultivates a kind of hope or a longing that sometimes our rational mind doesn't allow us to believe. Um, in the last couple of years, I've done a lot of work on college campuses and some in high schools, and there's a hopelessness, right? There's a hopelessness in young adults. They don't see much of a future. The political chaos, climate change, the growing tensions globally, and they don't see it. And there's something that we know in the Christian faith, that story can cultivate a hope and a persistence that actually gets us moving towards a world that the rational mind says isn't possible. We can find fawns, not the way we thought we might find them, but we can find fawns when our rational mind says that's not possible. And it's story that sends us looking, right? It's story that speaks to a deeper truth within us. Carl Jung says the soul speaks in story. And when we engage story as a sacred practice, we sometimes can make contact with those deeper places within us. So I want to just speak a little bit about what story is, and then what spirituality is, and then how we might bring those two together in the formation of children and youth, right? So story is the language of human experience. Story, every time I tell a story, and I would guess that each one of us every day tells a story. You wouldn't believe what happened at the grocery store today. My sister called. What did she say? Well, she's still struggling with her son, right? We tell stories. And every time we tell a story, we are saying to the listener, this is what it feels like to be me. This is what it feels like to be me. We're trying to make contact with the storytelling brain in another person, and we're trying to help them to see, hear, and feel what it's like to be us when we tell stories from our life. And so story is this full body meaning making. It engages all the senses, right? It's different than the cognitive aspects of who we are. We're not just working in doctrine and ideas and religious concepts. Story conjures a spell in which we're invited to relive an experience, so that our mind, heart, our senses, our spiritual side are all awakened to the pattern that a story gives us. Okay, so outside the Modern Museum of Art in Denver, Colorado, they put a shipping container, and the shipping container had a sign, and the sign said Empathy Museum. And if you had time, one of the curators would bring you inside the shipping container, and on 3 sides of the container, there would be little cubbies, floor to ceiling, and in each cubby, there were a pair of shoes, worn shoes. And they'd have a little sign that would say size 5 or size 6 or women's 8. And you would look, they would be invited to find a pair of shoes that you were willing to put on. So you'd find your size, choose a pair you wanted to try on, you'd put them on. The curator would take you outside the shipping container and show you a line of red arrows on the sidewalk. Then the curator would say, you are invited to walk 1 mile in someone else's shoes, right? And then they'd give you a pair of headphones. And in the headphones, you would hear the person who owned your shoes that you were wearing telling their life story. And so as you're walking, you're hearing a Syrian refugee talk about what it was like to immigrate to the United States. You're hearing a single mom who's working 2 jobs to raise 3 kids, telling her experience, a cancer survivor, a veteran of the Iraq War. And they're telling you their life story as you're walking in their shoes. When you return to the container, the curators told me they would give people a little 3x5 card if you wanted to write a message to the person who owned those shoes. And they said the problem was people would ask for 4 or 5 cards because they would need to say, I had a prejudice, I had a stereotype, I had no idea of what your experience was as an immigrant until I walked in your shoes and heard your story. You've changed my understanding. Or they would want to write, I also lost my mom at 4 years old, and I know that struggle. And I felt so connected to you, how similar our lives have been after hearing your story. And what was happening, right, is they were activating that spiritual imagination, that empathic power that we have to leave our bodies and leave time and space and sit in the life of someone else once we hear their experience, once we hear the story. So story is the language of human experience that allows us, they call it in neuroscience, they call it transportation, to transport into the life of someone else. And that not only counts in the shared stories that we exchange with those we encounter, but it also is among the saints or the characters in the Bible. If the story's told well, we can be transported through time and space, and we can sit in those lives, and we can feel Jesus saying, peace be still to the storm. We can feel the hemorrhaging woman reaching out and touching the garment or Jesus's robe, and feel the awkwardness and the sweaty bodies around us. And as Jesus says, who touched me? We can relive that. Our brains not knowing whether it's perceiving what's actually out here in time and space right now, or what's happening in terms of the images that are showing up internally before us, right? Our bodies respond to each as if they're real. And so in that way, we can open the heart to the sacred that's timeless, that's available, that gold thread, that gold filament that's in our sacred stories. We can perceive it and touch it and feel it when we're allowed to enter into that story world. Does that make sense? So story is the language of human experience. It's full body meaning making, and story in the Christian tradition is relationship. That's its power. So story is used for branding. Story is used for entertainment. There's lots of ways people use story, but in the Christian tradition, it's a relational practice. Story is how I connect to my own vitality and my identity. Story is how I find the gifts of the Spirit within me. Story connects me to myself. Story connects me to others, like that empathy museum. It helps me to touch the central core genius and vitality and beauty of other human beings. It helps me feel empathy for the tragedy and suffering of others. It can do that. It can create those relational vectors and lines. And story can connect me to the sacred. It can open me up to the possibility. And so sometimes you can't recognize the kindness within you until you hear a story about kindness. You can't encounter courage until you hear the story of courage. Stories uh, bring forth and coax forth certain parts of our human landscape that without them we have trouble accessing sometimes. And so in this way, it's a sacred power. So I want us to, I'm doing a lot of talking here, but I want us to do a practice that might help us investigate this as its own, because I want us to feel and bring into this virtual space this power of story, so that when we begin to think about how we'd use it with children and youth, we can have a common understanding, or approach a common understanding. So what I want to do here in a minute is I want to have us go into small groups of 3 or 4. And I want you to this is like just a little sketch we're going to do here. I want you to think of an experience you've had in the last few weeks, an experience, right? Of some moment where you felt connected. You just felt connected. Maybe it was connected to yourself. You know, you were sitting out in your backyard drinking coffee. Spring was starting to show up. You saw the little purple in the crocuses and little yellow daffodils just coming forth, and you just felt at home in your body and in yourself, right? Or maybe it was a connection to others. You were working on a little project at church, setting up the food bank, and there was laughter and stories, and you were getting the shelves up and filling things up for preparing for folks to come in and get groceries from the church, and you just felt part of a team, connected to everyone working there. Or maybe it was a connection to the sacred. You just had some kind of beautiful glimpse of God's presence. It just kind of came through you like a gentle breeze while you were laying in bed in the morning. You just felt, there you are. Okay, there you are. So some moment in the last few weeks of connection. And what you're going to do is in these groups, you're just going to describe that moment, that phone call with your son or whatever it was. You're going to describe that moment of connection. And I want the other 2 or 3 people in the group to just listen. Okay, just listen. And don't ask questions. Don't make comments, even if you don't really understand what they're talking about. Just listen. And when they're done, unmute yourself and say thank you. Don't ask questions or go into conversation. When they're done sharing, just say thank you. That's all. And then the next person will share for 2 or 3 minutes. And when they're done, you'll say thank you until everyone's gone around. Then you can talk if you want. But just for the sake of time, we're just going to say thank you right now. And we're just going to listen. Okay? Does everybody understand any questions? A moment of connection, a recent moment of connection. You're going to share that moment, describe it, tell about it so others can see it, hear it, feel it. And then you're going to say thank you and listen to the others. So every time you meet, how can you invite young people to savor and attend to their experience of the world? How can you help them, like with a metal detector, look at their lives, go over their experience, and notice those little shimmering moments where God is present? You know, so our work is to help children and young people notice the presence of God that's already there. We don't have to deliver God to them. We don't have to somehow, pour it into their mouths. They know God, but they never are given the peace and quiet and the resonance of a listening, caring room where they can notice how God is with them. And story is one way you do that. You know, tell me a time where you felt hopeful, and then hope can show up. And then as teachers, we can make that connection to experiences in the Bible, experiences in the church, the nature of God. It's so much easier to do it once that experience is in the room. Does that make sense? So every time you meet, you should have a story question. It can be simple. Let me just give you some ways you can do this. One is you can just say, when was a moment this last week that you're most grateful for? This is the awareness exam. And if you know Sleeping with Bread, that book, We're just going to look over the last week. What's a moment? Let's just go around and tell me about a moment where you're most grateful. Or tell me a moment where you were most alive this last week. Or tell me a moment where you felt love or you saw love in the world. And they tell those experiences. You know, we're training our eyes and hearts to notice the presence of God in the world. So you can just do that as a way to start every meeting. Then you go into your lesson and stuff like that. But you've got what's happened when you've done that is you've got students now come home to their bodies, they've come home to their experience, and they've practiced listening with one another, and they've practiced speaking. And so you've created a culture of collaborative inquiry before you get into material. So you could ask a question, or every time you're working on a lesson, what's a story-based question where they can look for a similar experience so that what they're hearing in the Bible is familiar? When was the time you felt healed? When was the time you witnessed healing? So one of the resources we're going to give you is, I told you we used questions with these women who worked with teenage girls who were removed from their homes and were living in a kind of a halfway house. All those questions we developed, we're going to give you after this workshop as potential questions. But you might have a question at the beginning of the room, beginning of your times with students. You might have a question that connects to the biblical experience. I'm working with young adults right now, and we're looking at the plot points of Jesus's life, the primary experiences that Jesus had, and then I'm asking story questions where they look for that experience. When have you had an experience where you felt betrayed? Tell me a moment of a memorable meal you had around the table. Tell me a time when you either participated in the healing of someone else or you witnessed someone being healed. Tell me a time when you felt deeply loved and honored, you know, that beloved experience. Tell me an experience of death where things fell apart, where you were no longer yourself. Tell me a moment of spring, a resurrection moment where you felt you came out of darkness, and you ask these questions of young adult, and they name these experiences. And guess what? They resonate with the Bible. You feel the Spirit in these moments. So how can you ask those kinds of questions? How can you connect it to the Bible? And then secondly, how can you help them enter the biblical stories so they see, hear, and feel those moments and relive them themselves? Sleeping with Bread was the name of the story. It's a beautiful little book that teaches the awareness examen, which is those little questions of gratitude, liveness, love, and how those connect to the our lived experience of faith. So let's try one more thing here. I'm going to have you, if everybody just closes their eyes for a minute, just to kind of, you know, so you don't have to, you're not self-conscious. If you want to turn off your camera, you can. And I want to invite you just to remember an experience in your life of kindness, when someone was kind to you. Some moment where someone was kind to you. It might have been very small, just someone heard you lost an extended family member, and they brought flowers by your house, or a neighbor left a card or something like this. You knocked some things over in a grocery store, and there was a young man who said, "Don't worry about it. I'll clean it up." It was a little moment of kindness. Or maybe it was quite profound. It was you were 18, you didn't know what you were going to do, and some teacher said, "Hey, how are you?" And they really listened. It was like a compassionate moment where you received compassion. So some moment of kindness, and I just want you to remember that. And if you could travel back in time and sit in that moment of kindness, if you allow that experience to come into your body and into your mind and heart, Just see if you remember what you saw and what you heard in that moment. What did it feel like if you could relive it to receive that kindness? And then what I'm going to ask Megan to do here is just to put us in twos, just groups of twos, if you can. And I want each of you just to share what came to you, this moment of kindness. And the other person is just going to listen. And when you're done speaking, they'll just say thank you. Then they'll share their moment. And then you'll say thank you. And then just notice what it feels like to speak and listen, this little experience. What do you notice what it was like to share these stories and to hear these stories? What happened inside of you, in your body, in your spirit, in your mind and heart? What was it like to speak and share? You could write one word in the chat, or you can say it out loud here. Expanding. There was a gratitude that's there. It's kind of surprising what was recalled. It was moving. There was an emotional. There was a fullness of heart, a thankfulness. There was even healing. It was an experience of joy. I felt comfort, renewal, safety. There was hope. There was a shift in my perspective, and I felt reassured and restored in a deeper way. These are the comments coming in the chat here. I felt just connected. Yeah, similar feelings. I hadn't thought about it in a long time. I felt a union with a whole different person. You know, the stranger was in my group. I felt loved. It was like having a big hug. This is a power. This is a power that all human beings have access we all have storytelling brains. We all love to listen to stories. We all have stories worth telling, and we all have the rich experience that is illuminated with the Spirit of God. And when you ask questions that you really, with real curiosity, and you create a space of listening, and people's human experience starts to pour forth, you hear the gospel rhythms, the gospel plot lines, and you sense the way the Spirit is alive in our lives, just as it was in the sacred stories we tell. So I just want to end with this image, and I know we're just touching into it, but I work, and maybe you could put this down in the chat there, Jill or Megan. I work with thehearthcommunity.com is the nonprofit I work with. And I just joined a project called the Austin Story Project. This is with Austin Presbyterian Seminary. And we're looking for 50 churches that want to explore story as a way of connecting their church and connecting their communities, and it's grant funded. Those applications go out in April if you want to continue on with this work with me. We'll have applications available in April. But I want to end with this image. A friend of mine, Martin Rowe, was so touched after being a priest in London for 25 years by the stories of people in his church that he hired a writer and a portrait painter. And he went to some of the foundational people in his church, and he had the writers listen to their stories of faith and paint a picture, almost like an icon picture of these people. And then he created a book, and the book is called The Gospel According to Everyone. And every Sunday, they have a reading from the Hebrew Testament, a reading from the New Testament, and a reading from the Gospel According to Everyone. And then the sermon is preached on all three. That communicates what I hope to communicate here, that our stories are sacred, that God is just as present to us as God has been throughout time, and that when we slow down and savor those stories, we feel our belovedness, and we feel the holiness of our struggle, even as mundane as we think it is. And we feel the particular way that we're being called to birth God into the world. And so I hope you'll find little ways to allow young people and children to have those contemplative spaces where they can sift and savor their human experience and feel the way in which God is moving in their lives. I wish I had 6 more hours with everybody, but I hope this woke something. Pay attention to what you noticed during this time. That's the most important thing. And blessings, and thank you for who you are and the beautiful gift of your life in the world. You are all a light, and we need you in this time. This is the time God made us for this time, and this is the right time for us to be in the world. And blessings on your journey.